Welcome to today's two-part conference. The title is going to be the same for both Civil War in the USA and the Second Coming of Jesus. It's in the form of a question mark. You will see why in the course of these two parts. This first part will consist, practically in its entirety, of a series of news items that have been happening from some time ago until today. And we will review them over the course of this time in order to see that there is a situation that has been developing and preparing for something to happen. And we will see how the people of this country, of the USA, are reacting. We will also see some very interesting analyses, despite it is a dense reading. Because what we're going to have this morning is a lot of reading. Stay tuned. Because you're going to see the mental landscape and what's been happening from some time on. And you're going to see what it's all going to lead to. I won't be the one reading the articles. I will be commenting on them. For the reading of the articles, we are going to have Angel and Luis and Angelda. There are quite a few articles. One of them is very extensive. It is in the form of questions and answers. But pay attention especially to that one, because it's worth it. But I tell you, the most shocking thing is going to be the last piece of news, which I received only yesterday. And I recommend you to pay attention, of course. Let's start directly with this news. I'm going to give way to them so that they can read them.
Bill Gates predicts an unsolvable civil war in the United States. I wouldn't know how to spend my money on it. At a Forbes magazine forum, the so-called philanthropist said he plans to finish the foundation he co-chairs with his ex-wife in 25 years.
Note that this news item is from October 1st, 2022, and it tells us as follows.
During the forum of the prestigious American magazine, Gates also expressed his concern about the internal polarization in the United States and was very pessimistic about it. I admit that political polarization can end everything. We are going to have difficult elections and a civil war.
Impressive, eh? Gates saying already, we're going to have, what, a civil war.
It might seem easier for anyone to fight a civil war than to fight Mother Nature and disease, but Gates doesn't think so. I'm not going to spend my money on that because I wouldn't know how to spend it, he said. But he left the door open to a slim hope. Anybody who has good innovations to reduce polarization, but can make the truth as interesting as the craziness, it would be worth investing in that. On this issue, he pointed to the success of a book by Robert Kennedy, which, as Gates himself explained, says, "I like making money and killing millions of people with vaccines. It's crazy how well it sells."
Well, you know, a lot has been written about Gates. A lot has been said about it all. On the subject of vaccines. And we have already presented enough information for you to hear these words from his mouth. But there is one more piece of news from 2022, October 29th.
Biden condemns political violence in the U.S. after the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. According to the president, all people of good conscience must oppose violence in politics, regardless of their position.
Well, here we were already seeing how things were starting to get complicated in a powerful way when there was this attack on Pelosi's husband. Another news item from 2022, November 2nd.
Trump voters ready to take up arms believe a civil war is looming in the United States.
And watch out now for what they are saying. And what a thing to say, really. Really, for me, very shocking.
Karen and Steve don't want to take up arms, but if the Republicans lose in the November congressional elections, this older couple from Arizona say a civil war is coming and, yes, they will fight. They have discussed it among themselves and feel that taking up arms is their best option. It was at this point that our conversation turned a little dark, and my faith in the strength of American democracy wavered a little. I met the Slaytons at their Trump paraphernalia shop in Show Low, Arizona. It was one of the first stops I made on a month-long summer road trip across the United States to understand why the upcoming November 8th midterm elections feel so significant, perhaps even a little dark. The couple were delightful hosts. They were funny and generous. They took me on a tour of their extensive inventory of extravagant Trump products and explained that, yes, there really are people who will pay $100 for a life-size cardboard figure of the former president dressed as Rambo to put in their living rooms. In fact, many people are interested. Trump, like Rambo, is one of their best-selling items. We talk about history, economics, and even abortion. But at the last moment when things got tense, it was when I questioned her belief that the 2020 election had been stolen. Wasn't it possible, I asked, that millions of Americans simply didn't like President Trump, and that was why Joe Biden had one? It was Karen who replied in an evidently annoyed tone. If you're a crazy liberal, we're just not interested. The mainstream news, let me call it that because I'm not going to call it fake news. But it's fake news to say America doesn't like Trump. The BBC is not fake news, but I let it slide. The idea of war, however, demanded clarification. It will start on a small scale. It will be like people against people, state against state, said Steve, who had clearly been thinking it through in detail. People have been talking about this idea of a second American Civil War for a couple of years now. Since the 2020 election, since the Capitol riots of 2021, January 6th.
Which everybody remembers, and which made practically all the news in the world about this, that it was going to happen as a consequence.
I find it hard to believe, maybe I lack imagination, but the idea that Americans would go to war over an election they lost still seems far-fetched to me. But that's Steve's take on what happened last time. When Lincoln won, it fired up the South, he says. That is not the only view of the origins of the American Civil War, but this was not the time for a history debate. It is the present that needs to be paid attention to.
It's interesting because obviously this reporter is from the BBC. You know, it's the most famous British channel. But when you talk about the origins of the American Civil War, you hardly get to talk about how it was the Jesuits who promoted it. And we showed that at the time.
As I said goodbye to the Slaytons, Steve issued a warning. He delivered it with a typically friendly American smile, but was chilling nonetheless. This could get really nasty, he said. My intention was to try to decipher just how nasty it could get.
Here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated on the orders of the Jesuits. And let's move on to another news item.
Trump calls for rescinding the Constitution to overturn the election result and return him to the White House. Former President Donald Trump claims it is a massive fraud that allows for the rescission of regulations and articles.
Pay attention to this issue because it is something really vital and, as we will see below, it has to do with prophecy. And many ignore it. To rescind the Constitution is practically to say that the foundation of the United States must be changed. This is a brutal statement. Brutal. But we will see the reactions to all this. Look, it was news on 2022, December 4th.
Former U.S. President and candidate Donald Trump has called for the rescission of the U.S. Constitution to overturn the results of the 2020 election and reinstate him in office. This is what he said after Elon Musk shared on Twitter deliberations about the files on the personal computer of Hunter Biden, son of current President Joe Biden. Massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the rescission of all regulations and articles, even those found in the Constitution, he wrote on his social network, Truth Social, according to Politico. Our great founders did not want and would not approve fake and fraudulent elections, he pointed out.
Look, the excuse is this: these are fake, fraudulent elections. Therefore, the Constitution can be blown up, because this would not be allowed by the founding fathers.
The Republican candidate has issued an attack on big tech by claiming that it works with the Democrats. Anathema to America. Accordingly, White House spokesman Andrew Bates has rebuked Trump's comments as anathema to the soul of our nation and should be universally condemned. "You can't love America only when you win," he said. The American Constitution is a sacrosanct document that for more than 200 years has ensured freedom and the rule of law prevail in our country. It has ensured that freedom and the rule of law prevail in our country, our great country. The Constitution unites the American people, regardless of party, and elected leaders are sworn to uphold it, he said in a statement.
Notice that there is an approach being taken here. On the one hand, Donald Trump is portrayed as someone who, if he has to shred the Constitution, he's going to do it. This could lead one to think that Joe Biden would be the good guy. We are not going to take a position in favor of either one or the other. We are simply going to show this news that has to do with this situation, which we can see coming, of civil war. We have already dealt enough with Joe Biden and also with Donald Trump. In what way? In that they are both linked to the Jesuits and have therefore been brought in to generate something in this country, which is certainly going to bear fruit. And what a fruit! You can see where it's all going, can't you? Once again, it would be very good now to start remembering what Abraham Lincoln wrote about the fear of the Jesuits coming into America. He knew that this was going to be the end of America sooner or later, and he warned about it. The warning cost him his life. Now we see the two who are in. One was already in office. Now the other is. The previous one wants to be again. They are totally antagonistic, and you can see with what kind of statements. Evidently, the Jesuits are doing their job very well. If they had made an attempt earlier to dynamite the United States as a country, which did not submit to Rome, they would have done it before all this, but they have not been able to do it yet. There were still elements in this country that made things, thank God, slow down. But that moment seems to be coming to an end. The Jesuits are about to achieve their goal, for which they were sent here from Rome. Let's go with more news, this one from 2022, December 23rd as well.
Biden laments the raging political polarization dividing Americans into reds and blues. In his Christmas address, the occupant of the White House called for national unity. U.S. President Joe Biden, during his Christmas address on Thursday, lamented the political polarization that exists in his country and called for national unity. Our politics has become so angry, so petty, so partisan, and too often we see each other as enemies, not neighbors. We see each other as Democrats or Republicans, not as fellow Americans. We are too divided, he said.
Interesting, we are too divided, that means. Well, you heard that, didn't you? One more piece of news from 2022, December 27th.
The Fourth Reich, the Civil War in the USA. 2023 will be like that according to Medvedev. The deputy chairman of the Security Council reveals 10 predictions that reflect the Kremlin's wishes.
You can see that this was from 2022. And this man from the Kremlin, of course, Medvedev, made some predictions that were obviously not going to be fulfilled in their entirety, but which already reflected something, that Russia is also pulling its strings. And he made these statements. He believed, or so he said, that there would be civil war as early as 2023. It's 2024 and it hasn't happened yet, but we will continue to see how it all goes on and on. This other news was already at the end of December 2022, on the 31st.
More and more American families are turning to food banks in the face of high inflation. For some families in the U.S., the December holidays are a substantial expense, about 10% higher than last year. In this context, more and more citizens are turning to food banks, many of which are stretched to the limit by a lack of donations.
This was the end of 2022. It's now 2024 and things haven't exactly improved. They've gone from bad to worse. And yesterday we were watching the news about the real and true data on unemployment in the United States, which is a country that is doing much better than many European countries. If not, let them tell us in Spain. But there are figures that, it seems, are being made up so as not to show that things are really getting worse. This one was already from 2023, January 3rd.
Most Americans predict bleak prospects for their country in 2023. Higher taxes, rising prices, and unemployment, increased domestic political conflict and crime are among the concerns of citizens.
And all of this has been growing. All of this, no doubt. But these are also facto RS for destabilization at the level of citizens. You see, it's not just a high political issue, a fight between two parties, but there are implications for ordinary people. This was April 3rd, specifically, of this year 2024.
Trump accuses Biden of causing bloodshed at the border. Under Joe Biden's corrupt leadership, every state is now a border state.
Almost nothing, don't you think so? 2024 is already beginning, and what a way! And this is something that has happened that caught my attention. I didn't know that they had filmed this movie. And you know that between the shooting of a film and its release in cinemas, maybe a year passes, or sometimes more. And on April 12th, this film, Civil War, came out here in the United States. So, could it be that somebody knows that this is going to happen and, as usual, Hollywood shows it and expands it to the level of a film? Or was it simply science fiction? When we have seen Hollywood's behavior, it's already sobering. And it really struck me, when I had been thinking about this topic for a long time in order to prepare and present it, that this film has appeared just now. Let's take a look at the trailer. I don't know if you're watching precisely the end of this video. Film select, do you see a 5-pointed star? In what position? Inverted. You know the significance of this, don't you? It's the head of Mendes. Satan, the satanic symbol, par excellence. Well, having said that, the truth is that when we saw this film appear, it gave us a lot to think about. What a coincidence, we have been preparing this conference for some time and now, lo and behold, this film appears. Anyway, Lord knows why these strange coincidences happen. Another news item from 2024, April 28th.
Biden warns of Trump's threat to democracy at White House Correspondents' Dinner. In reference to the continued criticism leveled against his candidacy in relation to age, Biden acknowledged that the 2024 election is indeed in full swing, and yes, age is an issue.
Yes, he may have an age problem, but Trump is not a young man either. If I remember correctly, he is now 78 years old. And you have two very old people fighting to be the President of the United States. One re-elected. But a threat from Trump? We have seen that before Trump, 2 years ago, was already talking about the Constitution, that it could blow up, because it was in his interest for his business. But I tell you, pay attention to what we will see later about a prophecy that has to do with the Constitution of the United States.
U.S. President Joe Biden warned Saturday at the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner of the danger to democracy posed by his Republican rival in the upcoming election, former President Donald Trump. Trump promised a bloodbath if he lost again, and we have to take that seriously. 8 years ago, we could have given him lip service, but not anymore. Not after January 6th, said the president, who denounced the fragility of U.S. democratic institutions.
And is it true that he said there would be, or promised, a bloodbath if he lost again? Well, you see, these are actually phrases that are there, verifiable. and they certainly do not bode well for this country. 2024, May 2nd.
Update on college protests. New York mayor blames outside agitators for protests. Protests have erupted at colleges and universities across the country in connection with the war in Gaza.
This is one more element to add to America's domestic problem. The question of what's going on in that war in Israel. And as a result, obviously, students are starting to rise up, especially university students. And well, those of you who are from this country, I suppose you have seen this all too well. Perhaps you have even experienced it at close quarters. But let's take a look at something related to all this, and we will see it step by step. But now, first another piece of news from 2024, May 3rd.
Survey. More than 40% of Americans believe a civil war is likely in the next few years. At the same time, about 37% of those polled believe that a civil conflict is more likely to occur if Joe Biden remains in power.
It's already interesting, isn't it, that they start doing polls analyzing the likelihood of a civil war. A breeding ground for putting this into people's minds? It seems to be working very well. 2024, May 6th.
Politico. Biden campaign backers fund pro-Palestinian protests.
Politico, not that it's a politician speaking, but that it's a news outlet calling itself that.
Protests at Columbia University and other campuses were supported by two organizations linked to a foundation funded by George Soros, the media outlet revealed.
Once again, we see what happens so often, that people rise up. And they don't rise up just because they want to rise up, but because there has been funding for them to make a mess of the country. Well, as the Pope used to say, make a mess. Well, of course, there are organizations linked to the Vatican that do this, like in this case, Mr. George Soros.
Certain groups involved in the university protests in the U.S. against the Israeli war and in the Gaza Strip receive funding from some of the main backers of Joe Biden's re-election campaign, including George Soros, the Rockefellers, and the Pritzkers, to whom the Hyatt Hotel Corporation belongs, according to Politico's analysis.
In fact, we have already discussed Soros and Rockefeller at length at the conferences.
The media outlet concluded that two of the organizers of the student protests, Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, received support from the Tides Foundation, which in turn has received donations from Soros. The tycoon declined to comment when contacted by journalists. Previously, the Tides Foundation was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which made it clear that it no longer has active grants to Tides, nor does it support Jewish Voice for Peace or If Not Now. Another major backer of the Democratic campaign that Politico links to the funding of pro-Palestinian protests is David Rockefeller Jr., who chairs the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The media outlet discusses that connection based on the transfer of $300,000 from that fund to the Tides Foundation in 2022 and the fact that over the past 5 years Tides has given nearly $500,000 to Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. In addition, the headline of the Politico article came under fire for showing surprise at those funding the protests against Israel's bombing of Gaza, calling Biden's biggest backers a surprising source of support for the student intifada. The mockery was not long in coming. Surprising? To whom? Asked Republican Congressman Jim Banks. Politico journalists are apparently the only people on the planet surprised by this, retorted Spectator contributor Stephen L. Miller. This is only surprising if you're new to following Democratic money in politics, summed up Republican communicator Matt Whitlock.
Well, you see, the issue is about funding from behind, from people with ties to the Vatican. People with ties to secret societies, working together to generate something that will add to the situation in the United States now. And now stay tuned because this article from 2024, May 12th, is an extensive interview, as extensive as it is interesting. We are going to see that it deals with Civil War issues in the United States, but also with some other situation in this other world, well, in the same world we are in, but somewhere else. Let's read it in the form of a question and answer. The headline, you see, the United States is heading for civil war. It may already be too late to avoid it, says Peter Turchin, the American academic specialized in the analysis of historical processes, believes that the country is heading for disaster. And here is a picture of the interviewee. Until a few years ago, that the United States could experience a new civil war seemed only an academic hypothesis. Not anymore. The growing tension in the country makes it sound more and more plausible. 43% of Americans believe it is possible within the next 10 years. 3 retired generals published a column in the Washington Post in December 2021 warning that a disputed election could lead to armed conflict. Some U.S. politicians even propose dividing the country. The idea has also jumped into the cultural field. This year, a movie, Civil War, has been released that deals with the subject. We, by the way, have dedicated an episode of our podcast to it, this medium says. Peter Turchin, born in the Soviet Union and a PhD in zoology, is one of the leading scientists in the study of this scenario. His discipline is cliodynamics, on Clio, the Greek muse of history, a field of research that analyzes historical processes with mathematical models. Together with his team at the Center for Complexity Sciences in Vienna, Turchin has been compiling a huge database of all kinds of political regimes throughout history, the Crisis DB, for years. They use it to look for patterns that help to understand how a society comes to collapse. Turchin has applied these patterns to the United States and his conclusion is pessimistic. The country is headed for disaster. He famously announced this as early as 2010 when he published an article stating that the U.S. would enter a political crisis in the next decade. 10 years later, Donald Trump lost the election and the assault on Capitol Hill ensued. Now Turchin publishes a new book, End of Departure, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Road to Political Disintegration, in which he explains his method and tries to warn us of the coming crisis. We spoke with him by video call, and now we are going to see questions and answers.
The main thesis of your book is that the United States is on the way to a violent collapse. Why do you think that? First of all, I'm not saying that collapse is inevitable. It is likely, yes, but many other countries in history avoided that end by taking the right actions. But it is clear that the United States is going through a very serious crisis. The technical term is revolutionary situation, and it can be resolved by revolution or civil war, or by adopting the right reforms. Have you seen the number of violent riots, terrorism, mass shootings, anti-government demonstrations? There is also fighting in the elite. The gap between the two big political parties is getting bigger and bigger. I will ask you about this later, but first I would like you to explain your method. You and your team work by collecting and analyzing a huge amount of historical data. How can medieval France or 19th century China help us understand what is happening now in the United States? In many ways, our societies are not very different from medieval or ancient ones. Large-scale, complex societies, states, appeared about 5,000 years ago. They are a system with 3 elements: the population, which makes up the majority, the elites, who concentrate power, the state apparatus, and the state apparatus. Our approach looks at societies from a structural point of view. It can be used to analyze both ancient Rome and the modern United States. All states can go through good periods of integration, peace, and internal order. But the data show that these periods last about 100 years, more or less, and then there inevitably comes a time of problems. I insist, these tensions do not have to be resolved violently. But when a weak society goes through a revolutionary situation, even a small spark can cause serious consequences. Such crises recur every couple of 100 years or so. Our modern societies are not immune to this dynamic, despite technological progress. What factors lead us to this revolutionary situation? You mentioned earlier the struggle between elites. The struggle among elites is the main factor. There are several conditioning factors for a crisis to arise. One is the impoverishment of the people, the fall in the standard of living of the majority of the population. The other is the overproduction of elites, which is the most frequent factor, the one we see in practically all the scenarios we have analyzed. What is the overproduction of elites? I explain it with the game of musical chairs, except that here the number of chairs does not change. It is the players that increase. The chairs don't increase because the number of available elite positions usually doesn't. There can only be one president, 100 senators in the U.S. Senate, and so on. But the number of players can increase. There could be double, triple, quadruple the number of people aspiring to power. Then the competition becomes so intense, and there are so many frustrated aspirants that some will be tempted to cheat. This is what we have seen in the United States and elsewhere in previous crises. Frustrated wannabe elites begin to break the rules of the political game, form radical organizations, etc. Although intra-elite competition can take many other forms. For example, duels, which were very popular in Europe for centuries, were nothing more than two members of the elite facing each other to the death. It turns out that duels increased in the run-up to and during a crisis. Today, thank God, aspiring elites do not kill each other. Public death scorn is preferred. Be that as it may, competition among elites is the most reliable indicator of an impending crisis. How does this elite grow? To continue with your analogy, if the chairs don't change, how do the number of people who aspire to a chair and get frustrated when they don't get it increase? Good question. During periods of peace and order, the ruling elites become confident and are tempted to reshape the economy in their favor. I call this the wealth pump, the perverse mechanism that takes wealth from the poor and shifts it to the rich. How this mechanism works depends on each society and historical moment. In medieval times, for example, feudal lords would use force to compel peasants to hand over more of their harvest. Under capitalism, economic elites manipulate the supply and demand for labor to depress workers' wages. Be that as it may, in a period of calm, the elites will set off the bomb. Perhaps 2 or 3 generations have passed since the last serious popular rebellion, so the powerful will have forgotten why doing so is a bad idea. And as wealth flows upward, there are more and more individuals amassing enormous wealth while the people lose it. This is one of the 2 routes to elite overproduction. Many people with economic power tend to want to turn it into political power. There you have Trump or Michael Bloomberg. The second way, which may be simultaneous to the first, is accreditation. The pump incentivizes the most active, intelligent, or hardworking people in the population to do what they can to escape misery. They study, they qualify. This creates an overproduction of well-educated individuals who aspire to access to power. Are tax cuts another mechanism of the wealth pump? Yes, taxation is related. I said earlier that societies have 3 main components: population, elites, and the state. Now let's talk about the state. As a society heads towards crisis, misery makes the population less able to pay taxes and state revenues decline. It has happened again and again. Before the French Revolution, the English Civil War, or now in the United States. But at the same time, due to the overproduction of elites, there are too many aspirants to power. The state, in order to avoid problems, will try to provide them with some sustenance. In medieval times, the enriched nobility would have second, third sons. Too many aspirants. The state would try to employ them in the army, the church, or the administration, but this would only increase expenses. And what happens when the state cannot pay? That was one of the triggers of the French Revolution. The same thing happened during the wars of religion in France in the 16th century. The state was bankrupt. The military who were not paid looked for other jobs, and were hired by Protestant Huguenot merchants. Private Huguenot armies arose. In the end, civil war broke out. A fiscal crisis of the state is a very frequent condition for the decomposition of the system to occur.
Well, here I think it would be worthwhile to clarify some of the situations he is showing us. And it is because he is talking about very cold data. It is true, they are data, and he makes them fit in a certain way. But there is something that is forgotten here. The triggers of the French Revolution. Yes, it is true that there was a social situation. But at the same time, once again, we have to remember that there was a work of the Jesuits, so that through the Jacobin movement, the French Revolution happened. And that is what is now happening in the United States as well. These things cannot be taken out of the frame, only from cold data, that although they are very well traced and may be totally true, in some aspects, it would be worthwhile to add a key element, which is the trigger for everything to end up exploding, taking advantage of a social situation previously generated, and sometimes also worked. As for the emergence of private Huguenot armies, we will deal with that in the topics on them and on some more related to them, such as the Cathars. And we will see that not everything that has been explained about it is as it has been explained to us. There's another story that's not shown, and that's the one we're going to show. But all in due course.
Let's go back to the United States. Donald Trump is an example of that elite that aspires to get power, isn't he? Yes, although let me mention that in 2010, years before Trump emerged, the indicators were already telling us clearly that the United States was on the road to crisis. I explained as much that year in an article in Nature. At that time, no one knew it would be Trump, but it's not really about him. Trump is not the cause of the crisis, just a manifestation of deeper structural problems. Before Trump, the Republican Party was a systemic party, but it is becoming increasingly Trumpist. They have crossed a lot of red lines in terms of respect for democracy or institutions. Can you say that the Republican Party is a threat to democracy in the United States? What would happen if they win the election in November? Everybody talks about threats to democracy, but our theory applies to both democratic and non-democratic societies. For a system to be stable, and you need a basic condition, consensus among the elites. The elites are supposed to follow the rules and enforce them. But as soon as that consensus is lost, the elites start to compete and break the rules, and the problems start. It doesn't happen only in democracies. In any case, I don't want to take a partisan stance on the crisis in the United States. The Democrats accuse the Trumpists of being a threat to democracy. The right wing does the same with the Democrats. They accuse them of censoring their ideas, of encouraging the culture of cancellation. Both sides accuse each other of something. It is normal in a crisis. When historians a century from now study our era, they will take a much more unbiased approach than we have now. I mean, who was right in the religious wars in France? The Catholics or the Huguenots? We don't look at the 16th century that way. We just analyze what happened. But back to your question, what happened to cause U.S. democracy to be in decline? During the 1850s, before the Civil War, there were also two parties, but the political system collapsed. As many as 15 different parties emerged. Now we are in a similar situation. The Democratic Party is fractured. The left wing has rebelled against the establishment, especially because of Israel's war in Gaza. In the Republican Party, the establishment is disappearing. The populists have taken over, and Trump is so powerful that no one can oppose him. It is the fragmentation of the elites, that conditions so typical before a crisis.
Pay attention to the importance of Israel's war transcends its borders. It even affects this country, the United States. This is the map of the secession war in those times, in the United States. The war that lasted 4 years left hundreds of thousands dead. It pitted the Unionists of the North against the Confederate separatists of the South. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people in the United States who are unaware of that history now in the present day. It's pretty much glossed over. And obviously, everything that motivated that war has remained just that it was an issue. Look, slavery, that's it. But it went much deeper than that. There was somebody who was determined to make the United States submit to the papacy. You can see what fruits this work bore: thousands and thousands and thousands of dead.
Let's talk about the other major conditioning factor, the impoverishment of the population. You insist that the key is not objective inequality, but how people perceive their own misery. Why is it so important to make this distinction? Inequality is a very useful indicator, but it is not what drives the crisis. To understand how a crisis arises, you have to study what drives people. And people don't know how to estimate inequality. Ask anyone in the street. How much has inequality grown in Spain in the last decade? What is the Gini index in your country? 99.9% will have no idea. However, the loss of quality of life is something that people can perceive. Everyone is trying to surpass, or at least equal, the level of well-being of their parents. During the demonstrations on antennae over the financial crisis a few years ago, students were irritated. It's not fair that children live worse than their parents. It's not about something material, but about the feeling of injustice. People, if they feel they are suffering an injustice, are capable of doing violent things to correct it. Rage is a much more important revolutionary factor than the actual conditions of life. That's why impoverishment is so important. People feel they are losing ground and don't understand why. The rich are getting richer. The sense of injustice is tremendous. Bright people who are trying to move up, whose parents have sent them to a good school and have made an effort to pay for the best universities, do not reach the welfare they think they deserve. They are people who are trained to be among the elite, but can't get there. But they are motivated and have the tools. They're the ones who end up leading the popular discontent that overthrows the regime. And all this, in your opinion, could provoke a civil war in the United States in the next few years. How do you imagine that scenario? That's right. It's not certain to happen, but there is a very high probability that the United States will live through a civil war in the near future. The biggest threat is, of course, the elections, especially the presidential elections. The next one is in November, and both parties have already said that they will not accept the results if they lose.
Notice that it is not just one party that says it will not accept the results. It is both of them.
Excuse me, both parties have said that? Yes, both Republicans and Democrats. Many Republicans and Democrats have announced that they are not going to accept the results if their party loses. Republicans say the vote will be a steal. Democrats will say Trump manipulates the results. So what happens when election results are not accepted? It happened in 1860. That's how the Civil War started. The situation today is different. Of course, the country is very different. But there are still regional divisions. It's no longer the South versus the North, but between the interior versus the coasts. Then the most divisive issue was slavery. Today, it's immigration. Remember, when Trump was elected in 2016, California, a Democratic state, refused to expand the new administration's immigration measures. Now Texas, a Republican state, is telling the Biden administration that it does not accept their immigration policy, and they want to pass a law of their own. The regional component is one of those that threaten to cause a rift. Be that as it may, the path to crisis is much more predictable than what happens once you get there. There are many possible scenarios. In about 10 to 15% of the cases we have studied, societies manage to emerge from crisis relatively peacefully. I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic, though. Our elites are proving that they do not understand the root causes of the collapse. Instead, they blame each other. As if they are feeding the monster instead of fighting it, right? Exactly. They don't realize it. Catholics and Huguenots in 16th century France were killing each other in duels. They were fighting each other, basically over whether you read the Bible yourself or the priest read it to you. You might think that's not enough reason for a civil war to break out. But of course, the causes of the crisis were deeper.
Here again, I could make a clarification. Catholicism went after them. It used the King of France, which, at that time, was a very small thing, basically Paris. And through subsidizing the French army, the Vatican gave it free passage to massacre, exterminate, in case they didn't convert to Catholicism again, all those people, which was especially in what is the south of France, what is also known as Northern Catalonia, Occitania. From there, they were massacred, they had to flee. But there were people of the Huguenots who took justice into their own hands, and they already perverted also the meaning of the Word of God. They were not supposed to fight, but the war began. The real Christians, the authentic ones, who did not bow to the papal power, fled. They did not fight. But it is also true that there were Huguenots who, yes, took up arms. But it is also necessary to qualify even more. There were knights who had their counties, their territories in France, and what is now known as France, who were in favor of the Huguenots, because they were, although their owners might be Catholics, the landowners of the place. They were citizens, very good citizens. They called them the good men. And they saw that they had done nothing wrong to be destroyed, but at the same time those landowners, so to speak, those counts of the time, what they did was already fearing that their lands were going to be precisely passed by the power of arms to the papal power. And that made them go to war, because they feared to lose their condominiums. It was not for a religious question. And when we deal with the subject of the Cathars, you will see to what extent the influence of the good men, the real ones, even reached the troops that defended them. Because there are moments when tears will come to your eyes, when you will see how the great and precious testimony given by these good men served for the conversion, in the last moments, of the troops that defended them. They were defending a territory from an owner, yes, but at the same time they were converted thanks to that testimony. Therefore, this must be nuanced, and sometimes the cold data is not only like that.
Is Europe facing the same risk as the United States? Europe is very heterogeneous. Some countries have largely managed to avoid the road to crisis, and others, on the contrary, have made a lot of progress. It depends on the nature of the elites and the social pact of each country. In general, continental Europe is at least 10 to 20 years behind the United States in this revolutionary spiral. There is still time to take action, this area of why I wrote the book, to try to get people to understand all this before things get uglier. To what extent has the social pact that is the basis of democracy crumbled in Europe? Sweden, for example, is going through a very serious crisis because during the 1990s they abandoned the model of social democracy that made them such a successful country. One indicator of this is the growing inequality. In the last 20 years, the number of Swedish billionaires increased from 4 to 39, a tenfold increase. That is just one of many warning signs. In Denmark, a similar country, the crisis has progressed much less because neoliberal economic dogma has not penetrated as deeply. So far, we have only talked about internal factors. What role do geopolitical factors play in the crisis spiral? I'm talking about wars, pandemics, migration, climate change. Geopolitical factors are secondary, but they can be very relevant. Great powers like the United States, China now, or the Roman Empire, or the Han Dynasty in antiquity are large and powerful countries less exposed to external influences. But smaller countries are much more vulnerable to geopolitical or economic swings. For example, inflation. What really matters to people, what affects their well-being, is the price of food, fuel, housing, and they're all going up a lot in price. Another factor is what I call geocultural influences, the flows of information, ideas, fashions. We saw it during the Arab revolts of 2011. The revolution in one country, Tunisia, spread throughout the region. Something similar happened 200 years ago, during the so-called Spring of Nations of 1848 in Europe. Ideas can spread across borders.
Let us also remember, as it is again worth nuancing, that Arab Spring, which we also showed at the conferences, that it did not happen just because, nor did it spread just because, by a mental epidemic contagion, but that it was actually being financed. And this is what also came to be known as the Color Revolution, as we have also seen with the Student Revolution here in the United States because of the war in Israel. People who move it, finance it, others jump on the bandwagon, and many of those who support those concepts will do so wholeheartedly, but they are unaware. They don't know they are being manipulated. They don't realize it. But that's the way it works, and that's the way these revolutions spread. And sometimes they end well, sometimes not.
However, a country's political culture can be very resilient. In China, power has been in the hands of the bureaucratic class for centuries, before during the imperial era and now with the Communist Party. What would have to happen for the Chinese regime to change? One of the reasons China seems much more resilient to these problems is because it experienced a crisis much more recently than the United States and Europe. Since the end of the last era of revolutions and wars in Europe, the continent has experienced a period of great prosperity. The 30 years between 1945 and 1975 were astonishing. But China suffered a century of decay between 1850 and 1950, and after the Cultural Revolution, things only started to mend from the mid-1970s onwards. Therefore, the Chinese have not advanced as far in the crisis spiral as the West. They have some problems. For example, the percentage of university graduates who can't find a job is increasing, which is a bad sign. But at the same time, they have a very low fertility rate, so there are few young people. This helps to avoid a political crisis. You know, a lot of frustrated young people is the best breeding ground for a revolution. Also, in China, there are no serious divisions within the elite. I insist, what allows societies to be reasonably peaceful and functional, regardless of whether they are democracies or autocracies, is consensus among the elites. And in China, the ruling class, which is the bureaucratic apparatus, the Communist Party, has controlled very well the other powerful actors, the economic elite. When some billionaire has amassed too much power, his wings have been clipped out. However, the Chinese are not invulnerable. They will eventually suffer a crisis unless they understand its causes and avoid. China has been a powerful empire for most of its more than 2,000 years of history, and yet its system has collapsed every 2 centuries or so. The last time was in the 19th century, with a textbook structural demographic crisis. There were too many aspiring elites and too much misery, and the Qing dynasty collapsed. It could happen again. How about Russia? Right now, the chances of a revolution in Russia are slim to none, for several reasons. First, the welfare of Russians is rising. It went up very rapidly during the 2000s, and despite the sanctions and despite the fact that there have been ups and downs, they are not that bad. Another factor, the most important one, is that there is a strong consensus among the elites. The war in Ukraine, or what they call in Russia the war against NATO, has provoked a strong consolidation of the elites. A part of these, the so-called oligarchs, have been ousted in the last 20 years. They have lost all power. But the core of the elite, the military administrative sector, is very united. There is one more factor. 20 years ago, Russia experienced a big drop in the birth rate. The cohort of 20-somethings, which is the raw material for the revolution, today is half the size it was in the previous generation. Moreover, many of these young people have left the country because of the war. So there is no reason, either at the popular level or among the elites, to think that the system will soon crumble. What about Ukraine? I was very struck by what you say about this country in your book. You argue that the regime is likely to end up becoming a militocracy, a regime controlled by the military, even if it wins the war. What is happening in Ukraine is very interesting. Before the war, it was a plutocracy, a system where the rich have the power. Ukraine was a plutocracy to incredible extremes, but the war has ended that. The number of Ukrainian billionaires is declining. Those still on the Forbes list have lost ground. Oligarch Rinat Akhmetov has lost 2/3 of his wealth because much of it was in Mariupol, a city now in ruins. Another great plutocrat, Ihor Kolomoisky, is in prison and the state has taken away his bank. Ukraine's plutocracy is being dismantled, which was predictable because plutocracies are extremely fragile. They are not a good way to govern a country. The question then is whether Ukraine will become a militocracy. But now I doubt it. I have developed a predictive model about the war of attrition in Ukraine. According to this model, it is not at all clear that Ukraine can win. Russia is superior in population, artillery, and military industrial production. According to some estimates, the Russians are firing 10 times more shells than the Ukrainians. Of course, there are other factors. Ukraine has been very good at using drones, but I still don't see them winning the war. So Ukraine will disappear as a state. Do you think that is the most likely scenario? I'm not a prophet. I just talk about numbers and probabilities. Our model predicts that Ukraine will be defeated in a year or two. You can force the model to say Ukraine will win, but only if you make very unrealistic assumptions. I can't say what will happen. Who knows? Maybe the Martians will come to Earth tomorrow. But my discipline, cliodynamics, is about studying trends and using them to make predictions about possible outcomes. Can we use cliodynamics to influence the outcome? And can we use it to prevent a crisis from breaking out in the United States? Yes, because we don't want to predict the arrival of a crisis. We want to anticipate to prevent it from happening. The United States is a huge challenge. It requires the political class to agree, to collaborate. The most important thing is to stop the wealth bomb. We need wages to grow at the same rate as the economy so that the impoverishment of the population is reversed and the elite stops increasing. But this will not happen right away. The U.S. is like an ocean liner, and it is already skimming the iceberg. Getting it to change course is difficult. It would require elites who know how to step away from their partisan motivations and work for the welfare of the country as a whole. I don't see any sign of that happening now. It would also take time. According to our model, getting a country out of this predicament, stopping the conditions that lead to a crisis, and getting back on the road to prosperity usually takes 2 or 3 decades. It may already be too late. If the big problem is the growth of the elite, how do we reduce it peacefully? Because the alternative is that it happens like in the French Revolution. How do we avoid reaching that violent solution? To do it peacefully, you need to stop the wealth pump. The incomes of the population will start to rise, and people will no longer feel they need to join the elite to escape precariousness. By increasing taxes on the rich, the great wealth would be reduced, and the overproduction of elites would stop. The state would raise enough to support itself and provide jobs for those well-educated people who would otherwise become frustrated with the system. Something like this happened during the New Deal. Between 1929 and the 1950s, the number of millionaires in the United States fell by 1/3. The country was growing, but the number of millionaires was shrinking. It was painful for many of them, yes. But in my opinion, it is better to lose some of your wealth than to be killed in a revolution or a civil war dive.
You have already seen that it was an extremely long interview, but extremely interesting. It was worthwhile to analyze these nuances in order to clarify a series of concepts. If you have noticed, the conversation, obviously, was basically based on the possible war in the United States, on whether it is possible to avoid it. You have already seen the answers. But it was also about two big countries that are now in conjunction and are the quintessential rivals, par excellence, of the United States, Russia and China. This afternoon we are going to see something about all this, and we are going to see that yes, there were prophecies that spoke about it, and we must know them because, otherwise, we are not going to know anything about it. But that will be later. Now another news item from 2024, May 17th.
USA, on the brink of the abyss, famous investor warns of a civil war in the country. Because of U.S. debt and the potential impact of further conflict, Ray Dalio believes investors should try to move some of their money out of the country. U.S. investor and philanthropist Ray Dalio has advised other investors to move some of their assets out of the United States, as according to him, the likelihood of a second civil war in the country has grown exponentially. In an interview published Thursday by the Financial Times, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, said the U.S. is on the brink of the abyss, as the probability of a war breaking out in the country range between 35% and 40%. Because of U.S. debt and the potential impact of further conflict, Dalio said investors should try to move some of their money out of the country. I'm concerned about treasuries because of high debt levels, compounded by high interest rates, he said, noting that he is also concerned about softening demand to meet supply, particularly from international buyers. In this context, Dalio pointed to countries such as India, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and some Gulf states as potentially attractive investment destinations. Political polarization in the U.S. Dalio's warnings arise from an alleged acceleration of political polarization a few months before the presidential elections between the current president, Joe Biden, and the Republican Donald Trump, which, according to him, will serve as a litmus test to determine whether the risks get out of control. The financial analyst assures that if Trump is elected, he will pursue more right-wing, nationalist, isolationist, protectionist, non-regulatory, and more aggressive policies to fight internal and external enemies, including politicians. On the contrary, if the Democratic Party remains with or without Biden, it will be rather the opposite, although they will also play hardball politically, he added. According to him, this civil war would be one in which people move to different states that are more aligned with what they want and do not follow the decisions of federal authorities of the opposite political side.
Well, now you're going to see. If you're wondering who this Ray Dalio is, here he is. Raymond Thomas Dalio. He is a billionaire American hedge fund manager and philanthropist who has been co-chief investment officer of the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, since 1985. He founded Bridgewater in 1975 in New York. Within 10 years, he received a $5 million investment from the World Bank Pension Fund. So, you can see how well positioned he is. And we highlight this in 2013, it was ranked the world's largest hedge fund. In 2020, Bloomberg ranked him as the 79th richest person in the world. So someone who knows what he's talking about. And here you have the person in question. He studied at Harvard. And another news from 2024, May 31st.
Trump will win the election if they don't kill him first. Tucker Carlson reacts to the verdict against Trump. In the opinion of the well-known American journalist, the jury's verdict against the former president marked the end of the fairest justice system in the world.
Well, you know that this person is being very controversial in his statements, and he is getting into trouble for it. Anyway, each one will say if what you say is correct or not, but interesting what he says. 2024, May 31st.
Donald Trump's conviction in the Stormy Daniels case live. The former president appears before the media after being found guilty.
And it says that Trump will become the first U.S. president to be criminally convicted. And we've already seen how this process has gone on and everything that's come up about it. Of course, all of this serves him to say he's being totally harassed so that he can't get the presidency of the United States. And logically, what we are seeing is that there is a movement on both sides, which only makes the expectations of problems pointing to civil war not diminish, on the contrary. Now this news from June 4th.
Reuters, Proud Boys radicals promise war if Trump doesn't win. The far-right group has become more visible during Republican campaign events and even promised war in the context of the recent guilty verdict against Trump.
No big deal, huh?
The far-right movement Proud Boys, which in January 2021 led the assault on the U.S. Capitol in a failed attempt to reverse Donald Trump's election defeat, is rebounding and gaining strength amid Trump's campaign to return to the White House. Reuters reports with reference to several sources, including 8 members of the radical group. Following the Capitol assault, 4 former leaders of the movement were convicted of seditious conspiracy and sentenced to 15 to 22 years in prison, while some 70 group members were charged with participating in the violent acts. However, the Proud Boys told the agency that they are preparing to act once again as a physical force in support of Trump, who promised to grant a pardon to those convicted of the assault if he is elected president in November. Is an outbreak of violence possible? One of the members of Proud Boy told the agency that the country is currently experiencing the calm before the storm. Thus, recently the far-right organization has become more visible during Trump's campaign events and in the context of the recent guilty verdict against the former president. The Proud Boy branch in the state of Ohio promised war and released a video of street fights of its members, accompanied with a message, "Fighting solves everything." Meanwhile, the Miami branch of the movement stated that, now, more than ever, it is recruiting new members. As the radical group's activity grows, including at Trump campaign rallies, U.S. society is increasingly concerned about a possible outbreak of violence around the November presidential election, the agency says, citing polling data.
Okay, and now let's go to the last of the news. Thank you for your cooperation. I already told you. I received it just yesterday. But you can see that it is dated on 2024, May 22nd. Horizons Canada. Our new flagship report, Disruptions on the 2024 Horizon, explores 35 events and circumstances for which Canada may need to prepare. Read our new report to learn more. The original is in English because it's a Canadian medium. Directly, here you see it translated. And look at it. From there, we have rescued only a few things, because it is quite extensive, and it appears in small, I don't know, if you see it well, I'm sure you don't, a whole diagram, indicating a series of names and circumstances. If we expand all this, if you go looking for it, you will find that there is also a serious problem for Canada. For Canada? What do you mean, for Canada? Yes, a serious problem. And that is that they already foresee that there is going to be a civil war in the United States. It is really impressive. Look carefully, all this is very extensive. Just here I put a series of lists of the things that they foresee that could affect them. And as I was saying, if you want, I will mark it here, so that you can see it, the Civil War in the United States. It seems to be pretty clear to them that it's going to happen. Extracted from the Canadian government page, directly, Interruptions on the Horizon. And he comes back to tell us, exactly this, Civil War in the United States. This is not a joke. This is serious. So, we have seen a lot of data in this conference, this first part, in which it seems that everything coincides and that there is going to be a civil war here. I wish it did not happen, right? Because nobody likes it, because we already know what happens in civil wars. They are the worst wars. The wars that are against other states, other nations. Yes, obviously they are crude, but they don't usually kill each other's relatives. In civil wars they do. You can tell that to us in Spain, can't you? The conflict is still going on, after so many years. Many issues are still dragging on. Well, the same thing is going to happen here, yes or yes. This is what we will continue to see this afternoon. All the data point to civil war. Now you are still very calm. We see that there are murders, there are social problems, economic issues. But you are not at war yet, are you? Notice that I was saying that one of the components, which also affected this whole issue, was the migration issue. Many of you here, practically all of you, are not originally from the United States. You come from other countries, especially Latin America. These are all issues that contribute to the worsening of the political situation in this country. Do you want to know how this is going to continue? Well, this afternoon we are going to see. Because I was telling you that there are prophecies that speak of this issue, and that is what we are going to show. But we are also going to show a prophecy that someone was talking about, before it happened, about the Civil War of the United States of America. We are going to see someone who wrote about it and got it absolutely right. And there are people who have called that person, specifically a woman, a satanic madwoman, absolute nonsense. And what we are going to see is quite the opposite. She got a prediction right in a very clear way, which she said was shown to her in a vision. We will see those writings. But why am I going to show you something of the Civil War? Now almost, I should say, the first Civil War in America. Because we're going to see that she also wrote something that was going to happen at the end of time that was going to affect this very country. But we are going to see that also in relation to other prophecies, which we have dealt with extensively, and which we are going to look at again briefly, to see how all this is being pigeonholed. And it has to do with a chapter of a book of the Bible, and some last verses of that chapter, but all in due course. This afternoon, let's go for it. I'll leave you here. Until this afternoon, God willing.